Gunfire cracked through the dusty streets of Tombstone, Arizona in 1881. Smoke filled the air. A crowd scattered. When the shooting stopped, 3 men were dead, 2 lawmen were bleeding, and a mining town that barely existed 10 years earlier had just entered legend. Newspapers from New York to London printed the story within days. To some, it was justice. To others, it was murder. Either way, the world could not look away. But how did America reach the point where gunfights in the street became normal? To answer that, we need to rewind half a century. The Wild West was born in 1865. The Civil War had ended, the country was exhausted, and thousands of young men suddenly found themselves without a cause, without work, and without limits. The East was crowded, the South was broken. Everything west of the Mississippi looked endless and empty. The government promised land to anyone willing to survive on it. Railroads were being built across prairies no one had mapped. And in Texas, millions of longhorn cattle roamed wild with no fences to stop them. Someone saw opportunity. If those herds could be driven north to the new rail lines, fortunes could be made feeding the cities back east. It sounded simple, but the trails were long, lawless, and deadly. That was the beginning of the cowboy. Most were in their 20s, rough around the edges, and willing to work for $30 a month. Many were former soldiers or freedmen. Others were Mexican vaqueros who had been doing the same job for generations. They rode 16 hours a day through rain, dust, and prairie storms. They slept on the ground, lived on beans and coffee, and carried their lives on their horses. The work was brutal, but the pay was instant. And when the drive ended, the celebrations began. Towns like Dodge City, Abilene, and Wichita exploded overnight. Saloons filled every corner, poker tables stayed open until sunrise, and gunfire became part of the soundtrack. Local shopkeepers wanted peace, so they passed laws banning guns inside the city limits. Visitors were supposed to hand over their weapons to the sheriff. It was a smart rule that no one wanted to follow. And that brings us right back to Tombstone. By 1881, the town was swimming in silver money and crime. A gang of ranching outlaws calling themselves the Cowboys had turned robbery into a profession. The law was stretched thin, and most of it rested on the shoulders of 3 brothers, Virgil, Wyatt, and Morgan Earp. Their friend Doc Holliday, a gambler and former dentist with a quick temper, stood at their side. When the Cowboys rode into town drunk and armed, ignoring the gun ban, the Earps confronted them. 30 seconds later, the most famous gunfight in American history was over. Tombstone became the symbol of the entire era, a place where the law and the lawless were often the same people. But it was only one chapter in a much larger story of greed, grit, and pure chaos. Across the West, gangs made their own rules. Jesse James led bank and train robberies across Missouri, his legend growing with every headline. The press called him a rebel hero, but he was nothing more than a thief who learned to use his reputation as a shield. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid ran an operation so slick, they robbed 2 trains in 2 different states on the same night. When the law caught up, they vanished to South America, still smiling for photographs. Not every outlaw was lucky. Tom Blackjack Ketchum tried to rob a train alone, failed, and was sentenced to hang. The execution became a public event. The hangman misjudged the drop, and the rope tore Ketchum's head from his body. The crowd screamed, then applauded. Some even bought pieces of the rope as souvenirs. That was frontier justice. Fast, final, and horrifyingly casual. For ordinary settlers, life was hard even without bullets flying. Cowboys rode endless miles for little pay. Miners dug through rock chasing gold that never appeared. Farmers faced droughts that turned their fields to dust. Every town had a saloon, a barber, and a man claiming to be a doctor with 1 bottle of chloroform. Teachers became preachers. Undertakers became dentists. In mining towns like Bodie, California, violence was so common that locals joked about a man for breakfast, meaning someone always died before morning. By the mid-1880s, the Wild West was changing. Cattle covered the plains from Texas to Montana, and the great open range seemed unstoppable. Then the winter of 1886 arrived. Snow buried the land, and temperatures dropped so low that entire herds froze where they stood. Ranchers called it the Big Die-Up. Fortunes vanished overnight. Barbed wire replaced freedom, and neighbors started fighting over every patch of grass. In Wyoming in 1892, the tension turned to war. Wealthy cattle barons hired armed riders to wipe out small ranchers accused of stealing cattle. The locals fought back and the U.S. Army had to intervene. No one important went to prison. Money kept its crown. The myth of the noble cowboy only grew stronger because it was easier to believe than the truth. By the way, if you love wild true history that beats Hollywood fiction, hit subscribe. Alright, back to 1890 and the US government declared the frontier closed. Every piece of land had been claimed, but the legend refused to die. Buffalo Bill Cody turned 30 years of violence into a traveling show, complete with live gunfights, trick riding, and real cowboys and native performers. Crowds across America and Europe cheered for a version of the West that had already disappeared. By the early 1900s, the gunfighters were gone. The railroads had cut across the wilderness, and the barbed wire never came down. But the stories survived, louder, bloodier, and bigger with every retelling. Maybe that is why the Wild West still fascinates us. It was a world where greed and courage lived side by side, where one man's hero was another man's criminal, and where every argument could end in smoke and lead. So yes, the Wild West was insane. Not because of what Hollywood invented, but because the truth was even stranger. A blizzard that killed an industry, a town that murdered its way through breakfast, a war started by fences, and a gunfight that turned 4 men into immortals. It was brutal, short, and unforgettable. And maybe that is why, more than a century later, we still cannot stop watching. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and if anyone offers to pay you in whiskey to drive cattle across a frozen river, maybe check the weather first.